Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us at the 7th seminar in our Garrod series, Organic Archaeology's Wetland Futures. This evening, I'm really chuffed to be able to introduce Anwen Cooper from Oxford Archaeology, who, as many of you may know, is currently Future Leader Fellowship funded by UKRI on her project Rewilding Later Prehistory. It actually amuses me very greatly that you're described as a future leader, because it's pretty much 30 years since Anwen and I first crossed paths on an undergraduate degree here in Cambridge.
I mean, I'm a bit old for a future leader.
Well, the point is that in the context of my career and the International Women's Day series of events that are happening here at the MacDonald Institute, I think Anwen's been something of leading the way in setting the bar very high in terms of how to be a brilliant archaeological researcher in British archaeology and academia. So I'm just very glad to have her here. And in between Cambridge and Oxford Archaeology, she has participated in some really formative projects in landscape archaeology, for example, Inglade, looking at grave goods, and also the Ebb and Flow project at Oxford University. So thank you, Anne.
Thank you for that introduction, Rachel. I'll try to live up to it. Thank you very much for having me along. It's really nice to see lots of familiar faces in the room. I feel like Cambridge is still a bit my home, and I come back quite a lot. So, and I should say at the start, this is the second talk that I've given in Cambridge in the last 8 months, and I can see that some of you here were at the last talk as well. So you can there's inevitably a bit of an overlap. You can have a little nap or do spot the difference in the first half if you like, but there is some different bits as well. So hopefully there's something for people who were at the last talk too. So for the first half of the talk, I'm going to talk to you about the project I'm currently doing, the Rewilding Later Prehistory project, which is where most of the work that I'll talk about today stems from. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to present the findings from an initial study of what wildlife was in prehistoric Britain and why this matters now. And I know this series is about organic archaeologies and wetlands, and I'll be talking more to the organic archaeologies bit than to the wetlands bit, but hopefully that's a bit of a sort of refreshing change. And I feel that a lot of work in this area has come from wetland archaeology, and maybe now is the right time to sort of balance things out and develop perspectives on archaeology and nature conservation from other perspectives. Right. So, the Rewilding Later Prehistory project, it's a UKRI funded Future Leader Fellowship. Starts in September 2022. We're looking at the Bronze and Iron Ages in Britain, and it's led by a team from Oxford Archaeology. So, a lot of these people here, plus some others who didn't give me photographs. And it's work that we're doing in collaboration with, we now have 7 partners and collaborators on the project. So, a lot of different people from universities, from Historic England, and our nature recovery partners, Netcastle Estate and Hepple Wilds. And the project has 4 main aims: to create a novel, holistic account of Bronze and Iron Age ecologies that prioritises the wild, and really this is about balancing out traditional narratives of later prehistory that tend to prioritise human progress. A second aim is to use this as a platform to develop an archaeological take on rewilding. A third is to create, with environmental archaeologists, a centralised and sustainable digital infrastructure for plant and animal remains data in Britain. And many of you will have come across Rob Wiseman's great Archaeology on Furlough initiative during lockdown, where he got archaeologists who were on furlough to join in with various research projects, one of which was identifying occurrences of aurochs in Britain, and this trebled the known number of prehistoric aurochs in Britain. And this was happening while I was writing the funding application, and it really hit home to me how little we actually know about what's out there still. And a fourth main aim is to mix up archaeological research dynamics from the current situation in which archaeologists at fieldwork organisations tend to generate data, and people in other kinds of organisations tend to curate these data and to set intellectual agendas, to a much more sort of mixed up research landscape. So a lot of what we're doing over the last couple of years has been building a strong evidence base for prehistoric wildlife in Britain, which, given my slides about how difficult it is to know how much is out there, you'll realise is quite a complicated task. So we've been building a database of all Bronze and Iron Age plant, macrofossil and vertebrate animal remains within 5 case study areas, which you can see here. And we started off with data held by the Archaeology Data Service, who are our partners on the project, but we've also gone directly to plant and animal remains specialists, both in fieldwork organisations and independently. And their time to help us out gathering this data and to advise us on our use of it has been fully costed for as part of the project. And I think that's been a really important part of how we've actually managed to gather so much data. We've also been building in data from existing readily available research databases. So far, and we're pretty much there really with a database now, it's mainly sort of fine-tuning. We've got over 1,000 sites, 34,000 animal bone records, 57,000 plant remain records, over 1,000 objects made from plant and animal materials, and summary data for insects, pollen and molluscs. It was quite exciting last month because I got a DOI from the ADS for our data set, because we're nearly there, and we're actually starting to be able to share it with some collaborators that we're working with. So it will be available to everybody via the Archaeology Data Service at the end of the project. So I thought I'd put in a Finland data slide just to give you an impression of how much data from this sort of particular region has contributed to things. And as you can see from these figures, it's quite a lot. So between a third and a half of the data in our data set is from Finland excavated sites. And that affects obviously the kinds of patterns that you produce from the data. Once you have all these data, you can start playing about with it in various kinds of ways. And I should say that this is, although I'm presenting this great database that we've created, this is largely the work of Tina Rusha-Nafas, who is the full-time postdoctoral researcher on the project. So Tina and I have just sort of started playing about really with the kinds of patterning that you can produce now. You've created all these data. So this is obviously just plant remains over our study period. The 2 arrows just showing really that you sort of get booms in deposition of plant remains in both the Middle Bronze Age and in the Middle Iron Age, which is probably what you'd expect. If you present this slightly differently, so as a percentage makeup, you can see obviously wild plants sort of slightly decrease in their percentage makeup of assemblages over time. But the main thing to point out here on the arrow is a sort of sudden increase in cereal crops as a percentage of plant assemblages in the early Iron Age, which is also quite interesting. When we start to look at regionality, this won't be surprising to you, Chris. I think Hadnam showed this sort of a long time ago. But it's quite interesting that when you look at the proportion of wild faunal remains as a proportion of all faunal remains through time, the Fenland stands out in the Iron Age because there are so many wild remains. So something is going on in this area, either in terms of ways of life or why people are putting stuff in the ground. You can look at regionality in other ways, of course, as well. So this is the top 5 non-arboreal species in 3 of our case study areas. And you could say, you know, the patterns that are shown here are what you might expect. But it's also important to remember that these are charred remains that are actually put in the ground. These are archaeological finds. So what would be interesting to do next is compare that with what's in pollen assemblages, and to see, you know, if these correspond or are different. And perhaps an unusual element of our database, and probably comes from the fact that I'm not an environmental archaeologist myself, as many of you will know, but come from a sort of a landscape background, and I've also worked quite a lot with material culture, is that we have objects as occurrences of taxa in our database. So this is just a plot of objects made from animal bone. 42% of the objects made from animal remains in our database are made from wild animal remains, which surprised me how high that occurrence was. But also you can see quite clear patterns in terms of what things are made with wild animal remains. So everyday tools, I mean, there's all kinds of problems with how you define these categories. Everyday tools tend to be made with domestic animals, whereas personal objects, weapons and horse gear tend to be made with wild species. So that's again something to look into further. So before I move on to sort of other aspects of the project, alongside this data gathering, we have been working, as I mentioned earlier, on trying to build a sort of better infrastructure for the future, so that if another team of people come along in 10 years' time, it will be easier to gather data about plant and animal remains in Britain. So the picture on the left comes from a book about Danish archaeology from 1992, when, you know, obviously the disjointedness of archaeology in Britain was still was already flagged up as an issue, and it's still the case now. And this is something that we really wanted to work on this project. So we've been working with 70 environmental archaeologists, digital experts, archivists, data managers and researchers through a series of workshops, GitHub discussions, and via our working group. This is work we're doing mainly with Historic England and the Archaeology Data Service, to come up with a plan for future metadata about plant and animal remains in Britain. This is not rocket science, we're actually doing something that's quite simple. So we're using the Archaeology Data Services OASIS platform, which is the system via which project archives, information about project archives that happen through the developer-funded archaeology, get logged. But we're using their new facility, which is called OASIS Plus, to log specialist data. So basically what all these people have designed is forms that will be filled in at the end of completing your plant fact macrofossil report, which will then go to the Archaeology Data Service with the archive, and then will be accessible via an interface. So this is basically done, this work. The 2 modules, as they're called, are pretty much ready to go. And we're just working through now what the interface will look like, how people will access it, but also how then this becomes embedded in everyday practice, which is obviously the hard bit. And having 70 specialists from across British archaeology involved in the process obviously helps with that. But there are a lot of small organisations that aren't represented in that group, and you know about this process. It's very difficult to get to get people to change their habits, and that's understandable. There's not much time, and it's an extra cost to be added into the work that people do. So another aspect of the project that we've been doing over the last couple of years is developing a toolkit for approaching archaeological wildlife. And this really comes from the idea that wildlife is a minority data set, or at least I thought so when I started out doing the funding application. It's not actually the case for plant remains at all, but certainly for animal remains. It is a minority data set. It's about 14% of wild animals are about 14% of our data set. And so we need to think imaginatively about how we approach these data, both in terms of the methods we bring to them, but also the ideas that we bring to them when we're interpreting them. So these 3 studies have been going on over the last couple of years. Julia Mean on the right, your left, has been working with contemporary conservation groups, looking at the sort of archaeological traces of hedge management, and seeing if we can use current practices to then look at charcoal remains from the past and interpret and try to identify hedgerows in the past better. Lou Matthews, who's here in the audience today, has been doing a palynology. She's a palynologist, and she's been doing a study of what we've called wild spaces. And this is basically about putting environment, rather than the environment being the back pollen being used as a sort of environmental background to archaeological sites where all the action is happening. It's about putting the areas beyond archaeological sites centre stage and giving a vegetational perspective on those. And then our horse-human relationship study, this is looking at horse virality, we've called it. So we've done 60 radiocarbon dates, ADNA and high-resolution isotope on samples from across Britain, so including in Scotland. The results of this are really nice. They're just coming together now. And then we've also had somebody from the University of Reading who's been looking at material culture to do with horses, particularly in the Bronze Age, because nobody's really synthesised that material. And just to say a little bit more about the pollen study, especially because we're here today. In the Oxford area, Lou has been synthesising published pollen data, revisiting unanalysed material from existing stored paleoenvironmental samples, and developing new ways, more accessible ways really, of visualising these data. But in an exciting new development, and thanks to a MacDonald Institute grant, Lou and Chris Green, who's our visualisation specialist, who some of you might also know, who worked with me on the Inglade project, have teamed up with the fantastic Fenscapes project. Who would not want to work with them? So we're investigating the future research potential of existing Fenland paleoenvironmental archives, starting out with the Geography Sediment Store, which Lou and Phil have been out in this week, with some exciting results. I think this is one of them, is that right? Some charred macrofossils from Retton in Norfolk. So before I talk about our work with nature recovery partners, it feels important to mention our current environmental emergency that creates a setting for this work. So alarming news about biodiversity loss is almost inescapable nowadays. So these statistics from last year's, or the year before's State of Nature report are one good example of this. There's widespread recognition that Britain is now one of the world's most nature-depleted countries. And clearly to counter this, ambitious targets have been set for creating wildlife-rich habitats in Britain and beyond. And nature recovery initiatives are growing to the extent that the UN have declared that 2021 to 2030 is the decade of ecosystem restoration. So obviously archaeology is not going to save our planet. But the Rewilding project team and colleagues more widely at OA, like researchers here in Cambridge, are thinking hard about how to shape a positive role for archaeology in efforts to restore nature. So in talking about this vein of work, it's really important to say that collaboration between archaeology and nature conservation colleagues is not new, and hopefully you've heard that in other seminars in this series. So as far as I know, the first conference for archaeology and nature conservation was held in Oxford in 1984 at Oxford Archaeology. It was led by George Lambrick and Mark Robinson. And at that time, work across this interface was described as work which has been quietly continuing for some time and which deserves to be appreciated more widely. Finally, it's reached its moment, but not for very good reasons. So it's important to say that much of the strongest work at this interface has definitely stemmed from wetland archaeologists and from environmental archaeologists more broadly. And I won't discuss sort of the contribution from historical ecology today, but that hasn't mainly been in Britain. It's mainly been on a global scale, which means its impact here has been less possibly than elsewhere. So existing and mostly scientific work in this vein continues to be very important. But the character of the current environmental emergency has created new challenges that I feel require wider archaeological involvement. So there's a new urgency about instigating nature recovery. Habitat creation's underway on an unprecedented scale. There are heightened concerns about time in nature, the origins of detrimental human impact, ecological baseline, species authenticity, landscape change, and the weird hybrid future past ecologies that we're creating now. And there's a need to negotiate complex relationships between people and nature, and this is particularly true in the context where we live on a crowded island. So moving on to our work with nature recovery partners. Our main nature recovery partner is Knepp Castle Estate, that many of you will have come across as a sort of pioneering rewilding project in Britain. They started out 25 years ago, and their aim was to turn sort of unproductive farmland on the really heavy claylands of the Low Weald into a patchier, more biodiverse landscape. And they were inspired by Vera's ecological concept. And so large herbivores are sort of a key mechanism for creating this change as well as enabling natural processes. And Knepp have been involved in our project right from the start when I was putting together the funding application. In fact, the horse study that I was telling you about earlier was originally their idea, and it was through talking to them. They wanted us to create a better story for their quaternary safari, which is one of the ways that they make their money. They wanted to know more about horses in the past and how they related to the horses that they used in the landscape now. But we've also visited them quite a lot over the last couple of years. And Penny, who was the main ecologist there, who's now moved on, who's got the binoculars around her neck there, not me, made me do a podcast for the first time very early on in this process. But it received 6,000 downloads in the first 3 months, which just goes to show how much interest there is in this topic, and not from archaeologists, from people beyond archaeology. Most of what we've been doing with Knepp has been listening to what they are interested in and what their concerns are, and trying to sort of tailor our research to meet those. And this will all be sort of culminate in a workshop that we're holding in September of this year, where we'll be having a pop-up archaeology and wilding safari, amongst other things, that sort of showcase the potential role of archaeology in wilding. Our other nature recovery partners we've picked up much more recently. So we've been working with them with Heppelwild since September of last year in Northumberland, a very different landscape, mainly characterised by heathland and blanket bog, and with a much more sort of prominent archaeological signature. So their rewilding process is quite different because they have a very beautiful landscape, a very beautiful monoculture of heather, which is actually really ecologically impoverished. But they're actually, similar to Knepp, using large herbivores to create a much patchier landscape. This is a much newer rewilding project. They only started in 2021. And our relationship with them is different because it's a smaller setup, and the owners have been very closely involved from the start. So we went there, we spent a day talking through possible ideas with them, and they said, we want stories that connect people and place. So we're working with the artist Rose Ferraby to create stories that link the people and the places that were important in this landscape in prehistory with the people and places that are important in this landscape now. So Stu, the gamekeeper, who's now in his late 70s, who's been working there for 50 years, family of John the farmer, who've been the tenant farmers on the land for the last 50 years. And just through talking to people, and Rose is doing sound recordings and short films, and also doing a piece of artwork. Rose has actually managed to find a new unrecorded piece of rock art, and this is what happens just through talking to people and sort of trying to build stories together about a landscape. Another piece of work we're doing at Heppel is we've called Stories of Landscape Change, and Lou has also been involved in this. And this is obviously, we've taken three peat cores through, they've got 9 metres deep of peat in bottle moss at the top of the hill, but which is actually not the most productive one, is it, Lou? But in the end. But so we've taken 3 peat cores, and obviously this is more about generating a story of human vegetational dynamics in this landscape, but also the owners of Heppel asked us to tailor it to sort of local interests. So they're interested in wildfires, which a lot of people, that there's a history of wildfires in this landscape. People worry about that, who manage these landscapes. So that we're using analytical techniques that pull out that story for them. We're also seeing if we can trace histories of the mining industry in this region, which is what the local archaeology group are interested in. Right, on to the second half of the talk. So for the rest of the talk, I'll present the initial findings from an interpretive study of what wildlife was in later prehistory and why this matters now. And this is one of a series of interpretive studies stemming from our substantial data set that we've collected, that Tina and I and Leo Webley, who is at Oxford Archaeology as well, who's the head of post-excavation, have been working on over the last few months. And hopefully this story brings together the various elements of the project that I've outlined so far. So it's long been accepted in archaeology that people in the past may not have made distinctions between wild and domesticated, or between culture and nature in the same way that we do now. Obviously people like Tim Ingold have been very influential in sort of selling this idea for a long time. But as formal specialist Naomi Sykes has pointed out, empirically grounded attempts to investigate past understanding of wildlife are actually rare. And so this is something that I specifically wanted to take forward on the Rewilding project. So I want to start this part of the talk with a set of quotes from Naomi Sykes' 2009 account of Worldviews in Transition, because they represent for me the slightly muddled state of play 15 years ago regarding understandings of wildlife at the Bronze Age, Iron Age Roman transition period. So Naomi did usefully synthesise in this article previous attempts to investigate Iron Age understandings of wildlife. But it wasn't really the main focus of her study, and without detailed further investigation, she's sort of forced to sit on a fence, basically, and suggests that wild and domesticated spheres did exist, but these spheres were interconnected. So, whatever that means. A lot of things have changed in archaeological studies since Naomi wrote this article in 2009, and also her inspiring book, Beastly Questions, in 2014. This includes in archaeological science, in wider ideas about wildlife and so on. One key change I wanted to highlight here, because I feel like the Rewilding project has contributed specifically to it, is in the amount of evidence that's actually available to approach this topic. So I tried to recreate Naomi's graph or chart of main wild animals recorded. And as you can see, we've increased it by about 10 times at least by the data we've gathered in the Rewilding project, which is a relief. But we've got quite a lot of stuff to work with. So returning to my investigation of prehistoric understandings of wildlife, like all good students, I thought I'd start by asking what ChatGPT thought. Obviously, prehistoric understandings of wildlife were quite intensely wild and included some quite strange creatures. I don't even know how it came up with that. But thankfully, it also said, let me know if you'd like any adjustments. So that's what I'll be working on for the rest of the talk. So I'm starting this study partly because I was working with Joe Brick on a piece of work who's sort of looking in similar sort of realms in the Animals and Societies in Bronze Age Europe project based in Dublin, with early Bronze Age faunal remains, and with what I'm going to describe, for want of a better word, as thoughtful deposits. So this includes formal deposits, which have been defined in various similar ways over the years since the mid-80s, Formal context, so animal bones at funerary and ceremonial sites, mainly barrows, and objects made from animals, including bone and antler, pommels and so on. So obviously this is a narrow data set to start with, but I'm already working on material from the later Bronze Age and Iron Age, and we're hoping in the longer term to build in plant remains into this study as well. And just to sort of give us a bit of extra data beyond the data we already have, because I previously worked for 4 years on the AHRC funded prehistoric grave goods project, and because these data are also available on the Archaeology Data Service, I've built in faunal records and material from objects in that database as well. So we've got a pretty good coverage of Britain. And these are our main guiding questions. Are wild and domesticated useful frames for archaeology to use to understand prehistoric faunal assemblages? Do faunal assemblages suggest that wildlife was meaningful as a category or as an idea to prehistoric people? And if not, can we identify other modes of categorisation or being in prehistoric faunal assemblages that are more interesting and more productive interpretively? So for those of you who aren't familiar with early Bronze Age faunal remains in Britain, I thought I'd just run through some of the sort of key kinds of evidence that I'm talking about. So this is grave goods from across Britain, and I think the main point to make here is that diverse animals and body parts were used in specific and knowledgeable ways as objects, mixed in with assemblages, as meat joints and so on in funerary contexts. And here's some animal burials of different kinds. As you can see, quite often animal burials aren't well represented in reports. So I've had to add in a little some pictures from modern times of other animals that are represented as burials that I couldn't find pictures of. And one interesting thing here is that there seems to be an occurrence of flint arrowheads with what we might see as wild animals in several different contexts, which you can interpret that in whatever way you like. And here's some other objects beyond grave goods, and just about 50% of early Bronze Age objects are made from deer, mostly antler, with sheep and goat, then cattle and boar as the next main animals that are used for making objects in this period. So we go back to those initial core questions. Here's some quick answers before I come up with some other ideas. Are wild and domesticated useful frames for us as archaeologists to understand faunal assemblages? Probably sometimes. Is there any sense from this material, when you go through it in detail, that wildlife was a meaningful category for early Bronze Age people? Not really. There are a few, you can argue it in certain circumstances, but there's no strong patterning. And can we identify other modes of animal categorisation in early Bronze Age faunal assemblages that are more interesting and more productive interpretively? Well, I'll leave you to decide based on what I'm about to say. So, one thing that was really noticeable when going through cattle remains assemblages is that wild and domesticated cattle seem to be deposited and together and in similar ways in this period. So there's no clear sense that attempts were being made to distinguish depositionally wild and domesticated cattle in this period. So is it possible that early Bronze Age people understood cattle as quite a fluid category? And this includes in these massive deposits like at Gayhurst Barrow, where the aurochs are mixed in with the domesticated cattle, but also in various other contexts as well. They're buried in similar ways or poleaxed. So another patterning that's quite interesting is that deer and cattle seem to be often dealt with in similar ways and deposited in the same context. So a famous example here is Barrow Hills in Radley, where in two separate phases so in the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age phase, there's a precise arrangement of cattle limbs and shed antlers around the ditch of a hengiform monument. And then in the early Bronze Age, a cattle skull broken and open in antiquity, and red deer skulls that are smashed from the skulls of slaughtered animals are used to define the edge of a grave. But it's not just in this context. Another really interesting example, which is much less well known, is at Peterstone in Gwent in southeast Wales, where cattle and deer are butchered and incorporated into formal deposits in a paleochannel. Moving on to formal contexts, many barrows and other ceremonial monuments have produced what are described as far from typical Bronze Age animal bone assemblages. So beyond the examples shown on this slide, unusual formal assemblages, including formal deposits of wild animals, were found at Barrow Hills, Radley, where there was mallard and pike, Church Farm, Tame, where there were red and roe deer, crane, dog, badger, aurochs, and at Barrow Clumps in Wiltshire, where there were wild and domesticated cattle, pigs, red deer, and a hare. And I think this is quite interesting because it's a pattern that crosses all of our case study areas where you do get faunal remains. And it reminded me of a now quite old idea from Gosden and Locke, 1998, that barrows are sort of engines for the creation of time. And it made me wonder if it's possible that these places were where early Bronze Age people gathered with and feasted on animals, and in doing so used barrows as engines also for the creation of ideas about animal worlds. So with objects, the patterning becomes most interesting when you examine specific object subsets. So shown here is a breakdown of animals represented in pendants across the whole rewilding study period and just in the rewilding dataset. And what I think is interesting here is that other than dogs, obviously, there's a significant and interesting overlap between the species represented in these objects and flagship or charismatic species that are used in nature recovery initiatives. And this led me to work by Jamie Lorimer, who wrote a book in 2015 about wildlife, in which he talks a lot about non-human charisma, and in particular corporeal charisma. So this is a property that's of beings that spark emotional responses via chance sightings, repeated encounters, or other processes of becoming familiar to people. And maybe species beyond what we would see as wild species fall into this category and were sort of understood as sort of in common ways in prehistory. So why do ideas about wildlife in prehistory matter now? Well, I think they do, because ideas about wildlife generally, both now and in the past, have gained heightened relevance in our current environmental emergency and are central to current nature restoration programmes. So many of these, well, in fact, all of these, it's a bit pixelated because I've had to use the PDF, not the PowerPoint version of this. But all of these are inspired by sort of archaeological incidences. So ideas about wildlife are actually central to current nature restoration programmes in various different ways, from how biodiversity is measured to how new wildlife settings are created. So Jamie Lorimer, in his wildlife books, discusses how there's actually been a historical turn in nature conservation. And in this context, I think it's really important to remember that ultimately some, and usually scientific and expert understandings of wildlife, become valued more than others, and this raises tensions for understandable reasons. And it makes it especially important that alternative understandings of wildlife, this might be from people in the past or it might be from non-specialists now, like farmers, are investigated and are used to put dominant understandings in perspective, to expose the biases and power relations that are involved. So overall, in this context, I feel that archaeology, including environmental archaeology, but also beyond scientific and expert perspectives on this topic can play an important role in illuminating that wildlife is a fluid idea, it's not a fixed reality, and it's not always meaningful. We can engage new audiences to help nature to recover, which is perhaps one of the greatest challenges of our times. And archaeology can also raise important questions about if and how wildlife is a relevant category in the hybrid and heavily managed biodiverse landscapes that we're creating for the future. So just to give you an example at the end of the kind of thing I'm getting at, I wanted to return to the Heppel landscape in Northumberland, where a new nature recovery chapter is unfolding. So in October of last year, the Wildlife Trust purchased just under 4,000 hectares of land immediately east of Heppel, including the whole of the Simonside Hills shown here, as part of ambitious plans to create the largest nature recovery corridor in Britain. Understandably, this is a controversial move in a region with a long history of sheep farming, and it's raised a lot of concerns about the uncertain futures of local livelihoods and landscapes, which this BBC News coverage shows very well. So to return to the theme of the study I've presented, I feel that balancing variant ideas about wildlife and about how to tend landscapes is central to these kinds of massive nature recovery projects and their success going forward. And I really hope that archaeological work of various kinds, like our work at Heppel on people and place, for instance, can play a small part in achieving this balance for people and for the world. And this is just for anyone who is wondering what ChatGPT produced when I fed it some more information, like wild boar haunting an old man. And you can see some really weird hybrid creatures in the back as well. Anyway, thank you for listening.